So this is AP World History, Chapter 3, Section 2, the formation of complex societies and sophisticated cultural traditions. So yesterday we looked at how Egypt kind of formed and how it developed into a civilization. Today we're going to look at the society itself and the traditions that they had in terms of religion and belief systems. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to look at is the emergence of cities and stratified societies, especially in Egypt. So again, in case you forgot, this is the area we're talking about. Here's Lower Egypt, and all the way coming down is Upper Egypt. And just remember that they have united. And of course, Nubia is at the bottom. So major cities will emerge and guide affairs in Egypt. So pretty much you're going to have these cities that are kind of the main cities that people will go to and practice any like commercialism, any trading. They'll have the main religious temples there, and they'll be the main places. For example, Thebes, they'll play a major role in terms of being a political center for Egypt. You had the Heliopolis, which was the city of the sun, and that was a cultural center. So depending on what city it was, also depended on what kind of specificity it had. So in terms of Nubia, they also had prominent cities like Kerma, Napata, and Meroe, and in different time periods, each of those played an important role. And it was a political and economic flourishing kingdom for the most part. And again, that was very much due to the fact that they had that relationship with the Egyptians. So again, this is kind of what they think that Nubia, the ruins of Nubia that were existing, especially this is Meroe. So in terms of social classes, we have, it's kind of similar again to that of Mesopotamia. You know, you have your peasants and your slave labor. Those are the ones that did the hard labor, that worked on the construction projects, especially the pyramids, and they're going to be at the bottom. And of course, the pharaoh, he will be at the top of the pyramid. And remember, this is a theocracy, so they believe that God is giving him the power and that he is pretty much a demigod in this area. A demigod meaning that he's half God, half human. And again, similar to Mesopotamia, they're going to have a centralized government. They'll have their strong military. They'll have their bureaucracy where, you know, it's broken up into a bunch of different positions in the government where you have governors, an army general, high priests, scribes, physicians, so very bureaucratic. They also had tax collectors, of course, within the bureaucracy. Nubia, again, similar to that of Egypt, they had their own government officials, priests, craftsmen, merchants, laborers. So again, very similar, very stratified society. And similar to Mesopotamia, this was also a patriarchal society where the men were in charge, and they were in charge both inside and outside of their homes. You did see the upper elite women. They took that step back. They looked over domestic affairs. They had their domestic servants. And again, similar to that of the Mesopotamian kings, the women, the upper elite women, would have that influence in the background on the king or the men. The common women, the ones kind of in the middle, they also did domestic work as well. Elite men, you would see them, if they were not a part of the royal family, you would see them as government officials, scribes, and then of course you would have the lower class men who would work in the fields as farmers, who would have more specialized labor like potters or craftsmen. One of the interesting things about Egyptian society is that both men and women could own property. They both could own slaves, and they could pass down their wealth to their next of kin, to their family. And usually that wasn't very common for women. Usually, again, it was highly patriarchal and you would just see everything happen on the man's side. And like we had talked about, women would influence policy, and sometimes they would manipulate the government in order to maybe get their son as pharaoh to move up as pharaoh, depending on what position they were in. And Nubia, you would see that they had actually female rulers, and that was a little rare in Egypt. Egypt didn't really have any female rulers. They did mention Hatshepsut, who was probably considered one of the first female rulers, but she ruled alongside her son. Okay, in terms of the economy, specialization in trade, you saw bronze and iron metallurgy appear, and you need to know that the Egyptians were slow to adopt any sort of metallurgy. When we say metallurgy, it's metals, okay, bronze, iron, that kind of thing. Um, we see it appear after the Hyksos. We talked about the Hyksos in the last section where they came in and they used their weaponry to take over Egypt. So that's really where they begin to adopt that kind of weaponry and metallurgy. And they definitely monitored the supply of bronze because they knew the value of it. And Nubia, for the most part, did not produce much bronze. So these are just some artifacts, some Egyptian artifacts that we see. So instead of bronze, the use of iron also began to emerge, and that's going to be really important, especially when we look at the Bantus. And it spread through most of sub-Saharan Africa. That iron spread mostly through that, and that again was because of the Bantus. Again, more Egyptian artifacts, just the kind of daggers that they used because of this metallurgy. Transportation, of course, is going to be big. Definitely going to have the use of boats, especially canoes, to sail in the Nile. But not only that, they would also sail beyond the Mediterranean. In addition, of course, you're going to see the use of wheeled vehicles, especially on the horse-drawn chariots. But they'll also use it just in terms of moving large items from one place to another, bulk items. The donkey caravan, this is a painting or an image that you can see that we know, that's how we know the donkeys existed and were carrying heavy loads. And of course, they're going to travel up and down the Nile River and along the Nile River. So the trade networks that we see appearing are, of course, here. This is an example. This is a map of all the trade that was done by the Egyptians, and you see they go all the way up into the Middle East, into Mesopotamia over here. And labor and transportation was encouraged. They wanted them to go and trade. They wanted them to go and get, different items from around the region. Areas they traded were Nubia, Mesopotamia, Aswan, and Elephantine. And of course, again, the goods they traded: ebony, ivory, gemstones, and gold. In terms of maritime trade, they would trade through the Red Sea, the way you see here, and then, of course, the Mediterranean Sea. And they asserted the importance of specialized labor and transportation efficiency. It was important for them to have something of value to trade, and it was important for them to be able to get their goods out at a timely manner in order to, create wealth within their society. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the writing of the Nile. And most of you already know that hieroglyphics is what the Egyptians used to write. And they're pretty much pictographs, which means that a picture represents a sound or an idea. Their influence will come from Mesopotamia, and it means the holy inscription, the hieroglyphics. Mainly, it was used for administrative and commercial records for the most part. Sometimes literary and religious texts as well. It was just that it was a formal writing, and it was very detailed. And you saw it, of course, on the tombs of the mummies. Even before entering the tombs, they had a story of how their king, their pharaoh, got to where they were. So again, this is just an example of the ancient hieroglyphics. The other type of writing that they used was hieratic script, and this was much more simplified. It was used for everyday affairs, so much easier to use in order to communicate and get your point across in a faster way. You see other forms of writing that were called Demotic and Coptic that also existed. Okay, so you can kind of see the hieratic script, just a lot easier and much faster to get the point across, whereas again, the hieroglyphics were more elaborate. In terms of um, formal education brought rewards. So if you were educated, then you were going to probably be in a higher rank in the government. Nubians, they benefited because they spoke both languages. They were able to speak with the Egyptians as well. And Egypt will influence both cultures in terms of education, and traveled into Nubia and built temples of Egyptian gods there. So education was very important. So the Nubian inscriptors borrowed from, in terms of Meroitic writing, the Nubian inscriptions came from Egyptian influence, and they borrowed from the hieroglyphics. And for them, their writing was based more on sounds rather than ideas. So Egyptians, they have hieroglyphics, they have hieratic script. Nubians, they have the Meroitic writing. All right, here's your discussion question 6. Create a Venn diagram of Egypt and Nubia. Include social, political, and religious trait. All right, now we're going to look at religion. With Egypt, you have Amun and Ra and the Andaton and monotheism. So obviously the deities are going to play an important role in the world, and they had various deities. They were polytheistic, which means the belief in many gods. So one of the main gods was Amun, who was considered the sun, creation, fertility, and the god of reproductive forces. The other main god that they worshipped was Ra, which was the sun god, and they would put them together at times and they would create Amun Ra, the way you see here. However, there was a time during one of the reigns of the pharaohs where the pharaoh had adopted a new god called Atan. And for Pharaoh Amenhotep, he was considered the only god. Atan was the only god. And this was one of the first expressions of monotheism that we see here in this area. So when this Pharaoh was in charge, this is what you believed. You believed in Atan and that it was the only god. When he died, you see these religious people come back, the ones that believed in Amun Ra, and they brought back that religious cult. So after the pharaoh died, there was a counterattack on the deity. Looking at mummification now, mummification was not seen as an end of life. Dying was not seen as the end and that's it, my life is over, but it was rather a transition. And mummifying the body was a process in that transition. And early on, it was only the ruling elites that would be mummified and survive the grave because they would get the process done to them. Whereas if you were a peasant or a slave, you would just probably be buried in the ground. So mummified only happened for pharaohs and the families, and it wasn't until later where it was available to other normal mortals. So it was actually one of those, if you could afford it, then it could happen. And this is an example of a mummified body. So during this time, you also have something called the cult of Osiris, and what this was a cult or a group of people that worship the god Osiris. Um, the idea was that Osiris was the god of the underworld, and the way he became the god of the underworld was that his brother murdered him, and what his brother did was he scattered his body parts all throughout the world. And Osiris had a very loyal wife who loved him so much that she went around the world to retrieve his body parts. And when he did, when she did, the gods were so impressed that they brought him back to life. And so, because of this, Osiris is known as the god of the underworld, and it was associated with the Nile. So, whoever was believing in this was the idea that you deserved immortality, and you also felt that those who didn't wouldn't get to be immortal. So Osiris was really the one that was making those decisions. Yes, you get the immortality, or no, you don't. For Nubia religion, they had their own gods that they looked at. Epidemic was the lion god. It was considered the war god. And then you also had Sebium, who was the creator god or the guardian of human devotees. They also did believe in Egyptian gods or deities as well. And similar to the Egyptians, they also built pyramids to honor their pharaohs and the wealthier people. And Amun, again, was also preeminent deity, just like that in Egypt. Okay, so discussion question 7. How would life have been different if monotheism stuck in Egypt? And how would daily lives be affected if monotheism had stuck? All right, so your takeaways here are that you really just need to know that this was a stratified society and it was very similar to the Mesopotamian society. In addition, understand that religion played a major role in their lives. They worshipped various deities and they believed in them strong enough that even if at one point there was this monotheistic idea, they came back to this idea of polytheism. Again, Nubia shares similar things with that of Egypt. Similar deities they worship. They also built pyramids similar to them. So again, there's that shared relationship that you see. All right, so for the final section, we will cover the Bantu migrations and the early societies of sub-Saharan Africa.